Hi, I'm Trevin Stratton, the Chief Economist and Vice President of Policy at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And today I'm speaking with Rana Sarkar, the Consul General of Canada in San Francisco, about technology in the time of COVID-19. Rana, thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Great to be here, Joe.
Thanks. So today's crisis makes clear the centrality of technology to our economy and society. And while working from home, many of us are connecting over video conferencing, like the two of us today. Social media is keeping us in touch. Delivery apps are providing us with what we need, and many of us are using streaming services for entertainment. And so, being based in San Francisco, the global hub of technology and innovation, if you will, can you share some of your insights on the role tech has played during the crisis?
Sure, happy to do that, and happy to be with the with folks who are viewing. And I think that the basis of that question, I think that we are here doing this webinar. All of us are sheltering in place. We are in many ways the particularly sort of the knowledge aspect of this economy has not missed a beat in terms of the functioning. And many of us are doubly busy at home with both, dealing with the crisis, dealing with our own family responses, but also in terms of our work lives, it hasn't slowed down much. And if anything, in some industries, it's accelerated. And one of the first points that I would say about that is that imagine this were to happen 25 years ago, without cloud computing, without massive compute, without back-end infrastructure that enable us to do this. So we're speaking on one platform, which is probably one of 25 different free video conferencing applications out there that enable this work. And so there's a lot of work that has gone on in the background that we have to appreciate in context of these crises, in terms of the real growth of cloud computing, the real growth of massive compute, and also the growth of a tech ecosystem that could rise to the challenge. And so I think that's one type of acknowledgement of what's taking place. But I also think that tech's response has been various to the crisis, and one is that big tech. If you look at the $5 trillion companies that are out there that, on any given day will, their rise and fall in the markets will be equivalent to the share price of Boeing plus many other sort of so-called real economy companies. And so that balance that has happened in the economy, or the valuation, tech is becoming the dominant form or the dominant node in all valuations in public markets, and the kind of power that tech has to organize markets. And I think that's the other thing that we have noticed in the context of this crisis. So it's not just the Amazon supply chain and the real growth of Amazon, which is probably 1.2 trillion today, probably growing towards $2 trillion. The growth of Facebook and Google within this context. At the beginning, it was a concern over their revenues. Now it seems as though they're growing. But it's also sort of, as you mentioned, the growth of the streaming services, all the content that we're engaged in. All of that is indeed growing in the midst of this crisis, and will continue to grow after this crisis. And so I think that those are permanent, sort of the short-term to structural shifts that are taking place. The other aspect of tech in terms of growth tech and looking at companies that are early stage and seed stage, there's been a real reckoning as well there. Some organizations have used the opportunity of the crisis to do the kind of house cleaning that typically happens during these crises. In California, it's the RIF process. Often, many companies using the opportunity to shed headcount. Others are extremely concerned about their forward revenue. If you're consumer facing, if you're in any way dealing with customers with long buying cycles, you are concerned, and you're probably into sort of a recalibration mode. And what you're seeing is a division within that of companies that have funds that are able to, or access funds have access to, 18 months of cash flow, or at least the horizon of cash flow. They are moving in one direction. and companies that are cash strapped are potentially moving in another direction. And so that looking at where your balance sheet is, where you're refocusing on unit economics, going back to all of the fundamentals that that new funders would want to see for growth. That's again sort of gained a premium. And so I think that tech, there's a whole set of changes taking place, particularly in the Valley ecosystem, which are really important, that probably started before this crisis, and many of them, including SoftBank and the rise of massive tech, sort of mass scaling funds that were out there. I think many of those funds have now pulled back. I think that the funding ecosystem has changed for at least the next 24, 36 months. That has changed. But let me back up a second and say there's another form of reaction that I think that tech is taking to this, and that's actually looking at how you can be useful in crisis needs. And many companies are pivoting in the midst of this crisis, recognizing that their core markets are going to be changed forever, whether it's an 80% economy that they're headed to or not. They are now using the occasion to sort of pivot to the crisis. And so if you're a company that's looking at the provision of the emergency response equipment, to looking at PPE is probably the thin edge of it, but also companies that are looking at how they can use their business model to be effective in the kind of economy that's going to emerge in the next 6 months, and then also soon after. And so there's that immediate response. You're seeing it with in health response, particularly lots of really innovative stuff happening on therapeutics, lots of interesting stuff happening on drug discovery. And so there's that aspect to it as well. And of course, the thing that's probably in the press the most in terms of tech and in COVID-19 is just the content tracing app or content and also sort of the contact tracing apps that are out there right now. The Google-Apple partnership is one of them, but you're also seeing responses in a variety of different countries that have privacy concerns associated with them, how they'll be adopted, what the role of the state in the context of the use of those are going to be are real open questions. And so there's a lot of very open questions on that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because I mean, some of these issues preceded the crisis itself, and the crisis just almost accelerated it. And so, one of those is at the same time, there's still kind of this debate going on about whether the COVID crisis will reverse the tech lash that we've seen in recent years. Recently the MIT Technology Review just had a piece on how COVID blew apart the myth of Silicon Valley innovation, because it's shown that we need physical items like masks and ventilators as opposed to intangibles. And so I was wondering, maybe you can share what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I think that, Mark Andreessen recently had a big post out saying that we need to build now. And there's always been a tension in Silicon Valley between the makers and the scalers. And in some ways, I mean, the maker culture has always been here. It's a deep engineering culture where people come in and quite frankly, just try sometimes ridiculous ideas, and sometimes it's very much the garage culture, or the more recently sort of the ramen based sort of startup culture that takes place here. And some of those ridiculous ideas actually turn into real businesses, and some of them are actually based on deep tech as well. And so that's the other thing that gets missed around here, is that it's not all just the app economy that's operating here. And so a lot of the real talent in Silicon Valley was gravitating. If you're a maker, you were gravitating towards some very interesting spaces, including crypto and the whole distributed ledger space, where you can really create new products and real new markets. A lot of folks working in space tech, a lot of people working in deep health in many ways. And so there's lots of of that maker vibe that is still there. And if anything, whenever a crisis happens in Silicon Valley, the pendulum starts to shift back to the maker culture, because it's the kind of underlying undergrowth of this place. And so, and the scaling culture, because the rewards and all of the incentive structures around, coming to the Valley to, grow a company, to make it into a unicorn, to, create some sort of billion-dollar play, is always the kind of background radiating narrative of the place. And that, of course, has, taken a lot of energy, and it's gone through a massive bubble, if anything, in the last while. And so, and I think that, to my previous comment, I think that there's a little bit of a scale back, just because, the funding culture's changed, return to unit economics and, path to profitability is certainly there within organizations. So that whole mindset has taken a sort of a step back.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's also a very important point. And at the chamber, we've been saying for years that tech isn't just a sector anymore. It's a horizontal that cuts across different sectors, and then we see organizations of all types adopting technology and adopting innovation as part of their raison d'etre. And so in this way too, it's we've seen the crisis accelerate that in a number of different ways too. Certainly, we're still in the heart of the crisis, and there are a lot of Canadians and a lot of businesses that are hurting right now. But if we do have kind of the opportunity to look ahead to where we can focus on recovery, what will this kind of new world look like from a technology standpoint? Has the crisis changed the trajectory of what we were seeing before? And maybe if you can speak a bit about what does Canada need to do to adapt to this new environment as developing?
Thanks. And I think that idea of acceleration, I think, is the key. And we are the trend lines that we've been seeing for the better part of a decade have been in many ways exposed. And it's a little bit of a paraphrase of that Buffett analogy of when the water goes out, you see who's not wearing clothing. And in a way, when the water went out this way, we also saw how much the tech economy has fundamentally changed so many different industries, and which industries were precarious for a long time, and our assumptions around those industries are fundamentally changed. And so I think that these accelerant aspects of what the crisis is are already there. And so what does that mean? That means sort of much larger scale forced adoption in many ways, across organizations of so-called tech-based solutions. And that's just not, having programs and, program leadership and all of these sort of tech adoption programs within organizations. I think it's a fundamental rethink of, the entire chain of what the organization is for and who it's delivering value to. And so, if you go back to that Dan Coates sort of notion of what the firm is for, and, the firm typically has worked as an efficient deliverer of services and of value when it could be done better within that organization versus without. And I think now what we're recognizing, it's not just the Zoomification of the world. It's not just the fact that people are realizing that with cloud, with various types of work processes that we're developing in real time, quite frankly, in terms of just how we run virtual organizations, what is core to that organization. And so organizations are all having this internal rethink in terms of who are they, what do they need, what kind of capital they need, what kind of workforce do they need, what sorts of infrastructure they need. The second part of that is that who is their customer is also fundamentally changing in the context of this crisis. And I think that many folks relate to the fact that this, maybe the economy is not going to come back, or the consumption patterns are not going to come back to 100% of what they were. Maybe we are into a long pattern of the so-called 80 or 90% economy, where you don't see the return of many types of services or consumption patterns, be they in retail or consumer products, or even for business consumption. And so what does that mean? So now, and what are the channels through which you're going to be looking to address that new customer, or fundamentally looking at new markets, growing your product mix, looking at addressing new markets and new products at the same time? And what sort of workforce are you going to need, and what's that workforce construction going to look like? And I think that, so all of these questions are, every organization is going to have to go through, and they're unique to every organization, but there will be challenges in the midst of it. I think that we've got a short-term challenge where, once we've dealt with the crisis of liquidity, we're going to have to deal with the crisis of solvency for a lot of organizations, and that's going to create an enormous amount of noise sometime in the fall and thereafter. But once the so-called new abnormal starts in earnest sometime in probably 2021, we'll have a better sense of the structure of that next economy and what demand starts to look like, how real consumer behavior is going to act, how real companies are starting to invest into that marketplace. I think Canada's got an enormous opportunity in the midst of this. I think that the two of the key factors that people are going to look for in order to locate is they're going to look for talent, and they're going to look to be engaged in places where there is an abundance of what they call loose talent. And those are people who are maybe overqualified, maybe people who are highly motivated, who live in good concentrations, and who are also organized in a way that companies and organizations can get access to. They live in cities, they consume in a certain way, and so I think that those a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of companies that are looking to now use the option of being mobile. They used to think that they needed to be in the Valley, or they needed to be in London, or they needed to be in New York. Now they're thinking, you know what, we could be anywhere. And what is a jurisdiction that has the access to talent? Second is access to capital and access to a government that functions. And that third part is actually it's that idea that we've managed well out of this crisis, and that we've managed the epidemiological crises, and we've also managed the economic response, and that's layered on top of all of the institutions and infrastructure the various governments in Canada built over decades. That puts Canada in a great light. And so I think that in terms of our attractiveness, our weapons of mass attraction, that is going to be a significant part of it. And what I would say is that there's also a fundamental shift taking place in the way that we see our economy, in the sense that we have major changes in the plate tectonics of our economy, from energy to financial services to technology to all of these things. There are these plates are moving, and and governments are likely, given the way global geoeconomics are working, are going to have to be engaged much more in helping these shifts occur. Worldwide, have been working on coordinated strategies between government and industry to figure out where we need to be investing, and whether that's in people, whether that's building better institutions, whether that's building better public infrastructure, the use of procurement power, the catalytic forces that we're starting to see practiced in this crisis are going to be superpowers when we come out of this crisis.
Well, there you have it. Technology in the time of COVID-19 from Consul General Rana Sarkar, Consul General of Canada in San Francisco. Thanks again for taking the time to join us here today, Rana.
Thanks for having me.